We're here to talk about Romanticism, and we're going to talk about three paintings, one by the Englishman Constable, one by the German Friedrich, and one finally by the Frenchman Géricault. But before we even talk about the painting, I think I want to talk a little bit about Romanticism as this sort of broader group of arts and culture. You know, there was writing, the Romantic poets of England, Beethoven, and the incredible sense of drama and emotion.
Yes.
And Romanticism really is about putting human emotion to the fore.
That's certainly one of the things Romanticism is about, whether we look at it in England or in France or in Germany. When we're looking at this Constable that we have up on the screen.
This is the White Horse.
Right, from around 1819.
It's
right?
one of his 6 footers,
right.
which is really important.
Right, because he wanted these landscapes, a lowly genre, right? Landscapes is a low genre, but he wanted them to be taken seriously at the exhibitions of the Royal Academy.
As if it were a religious painting, as if it was history painting,
right.
the grand
So he
scale.
made them very large, which was a very radical thing to do to landscape painting.
And it would have an enormous impact later in the century. You know, the Impressionists would look back, and in a sense, this is legitimizing landscape
painting, absolutely. But what I was going to say, when I was thinking, when you were saying something about emotion as an important characteristic of Romanticism, I was thinking about how something Constable said. He said, for me, painting is another word for feeling. And I think that might be a hard thing for us to sense at first when we're looking at this painting of the White Horse, because it looks like, maybe to us, it's just sort of kind of normal, pretty
landscape,
English landscape painting.
With, you know, a farm in the background.
But I'm not seeing a lot of emotion and turbulence
but this
here.
place that Constable is painting is incredibly important to him. This is where he grew up. This
Personally,
it's his
right.
father's farm.
Right, and it's about a sort of personal emotion.
Yeah,
right.
It's about nostalgia. It's about memory.
And right, so this is the place he grew up. His father was a landowner, and he has a real attachment. This is the place where he spent his boyhood, and so he's familiar with every nook and cranny and every tree and the streams, and is really trying to evoke for us the smells, the feeling, you know, the weather, the atmosphere, everything, in order to have a kind of sentimental, nostalgic sort of evocation of this place.
And he does an incredible job. What's so interesting in relationship to what you're saying is that there's a kind of specificity that is really quite extraordinary. And of course, Constable is one of the very first artists to really try to render nature almost from a kind of scientific attitude. I mean, Leonardo did this to some extent, of course, but here we have Constable who's actually studying cloud formations so that they're accurate. These are trees that can actually be identified.
Right, but all of that interest in true observation is because he wants to render this place as truly and as sincerely as possible to evoke those kinds of feelings.
But here's the problem. The world that he's evoking is a world that is already gone. You know, by the time this is being painted, it's almost 1820, and the trains are moving through England.
Sort of starting to.
They're just starting to, and what we're being shown here is an old barge that would have been used to move grain, perhaps, to market. And what's happening,
along
of course,
the canals.
that's right, and the horse is being shuttled to the other side because that's where the path picks up, and the horse will, of course, pull the barge. That's right, will pull the barge along this canal, as you said. So this is really evoking not only his memory, but in a sense an era.
Lost England.
That's right, an era that is already gone.
Yep.
That's right, and will change radically in the next few years.
And don't forget, we're also, you know, just a little bit more than a decade away from the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which hugely extended the franchise, which at this point is limited to very wealthy landowners. So at this point, there's also a lot of social agitation in England to extend the franchise.
But you wouldn't know that from looking at this painting because it is so bucolic, it is so peaceful, and it is so
timeless.
Timeless, but it's also an image of man in control of nature. And there's
in harmony with nature.
But other representations of Romanticism are very different.
That's true. Should we move on to another one?
Yeah, let's.
Okay, so here we have our next image, Caspar David Friedrich, and it's basically exactly the same date as the Constable.
About 4 years later.
About a few years later, and it's called The Sea of Ice.
And here, this is not man in control of nature.
Not at all.
This is nature's power, its majesty.
Over man.
Its awesomeness.
Yes, it's maybe hard to see, but here's a ship that has obviously gone down and faced
It's
a
been
giant
subsumed.
glacier that took it down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's subsumed by this Arctic
And I
Sea.
assume everyone on that ship
Is
long
perished.
dead.
Yes, absolutely.
Horrible death.
It's a desert of ice, and
Silence.
it is,
Here.
except that I also imagine those
creaking.
huge pieces of ice sort of crashing slowly into each other,
Yeah.
creating these terrible sounds.
Yeah. And so there's something sort of heroic about this, even in
So
terms
what's
of
heroic?
nature.
Yes, it's nature that's heroic,
Yeah.
and man has been belittled
Yeah.
in the face of the power and the majesty
Yes.
of not just nature, but really of God. Because look at the ice; it breaks upward as if it's a Gothic
And
cathedral.
the sky kind of parts too, with that cloud right above it.
You know what's interesting is Friedrich was part of a group that included philosophers like the Schlegels who were interested in the idea of how in the new industrial era, in the 19th century, how was it possible for spirituality to remain purposeful and legitimate. In other words, for a painter, one could no longer really paint God as an old man with a beard on a chair
Right,
on a cloud. It's absurd.
Right, using standard Christian iconography, the Annunciation, the Crucifixion, the story of the life of Christ, those things don't work so well anymore in terms of evoking a kind of religious or spiritual feeling in the viewer.
So how, in an age when we scientifically understand the mechanics of the world to a much greater extent than had ever been possible before, how can we still represent the power of God?
And the awesomeness of God, right?
That's right.
And it's in nature. It becomes located in nature for the German Romantic painters.
That's right. But this was a powerful idea
It's a new
across
idea.
Europe.
And it's still very much with us, that
Absolutely.
idea of seeing God in nature instead of in that standard Christian iconography.
I think that's true.
But it's interesting to me that at this moment when human beings, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, are really feeling their ability to control nature and master nature and develop technologies and better mankind, that we feel this enormous power, but at the same time we're telling ourselves these lessons like this painting, or
Yes,
for
yes.
example
It's a reminder.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of how small we really are and how limited our power really is.
It's true. And if you think about what the world has just gone through, the
French
The French
Revolution.
Revolution is not very far away, and that had been incredibly exciting and terrible simultaneously.
Terrifying.
Absolutely
Yeah.
terrifying.
The whole world had been turned upside down. The whole old order
That's
was
right.
gone.
And man thought of themselves in control, but were we?
We weren't, right.
But were
and
we?
the revolution brought that feeling home too.
That's
Absolutely.
right. There was a term that was used at this time that I think is important to understanding the sense of the awesomeness and this sort of terrible beauty of
Terrifying,
nature.
frightening
Frightening.
beauty.
And this is the word sublime, and it was Edmund Burke that really used this.
Right.
And it's perfect for this painting, isn't it?
Characterizes a lot of work from this period. Next work we were going to talk about is a painting by a French Romantic painter named
Géricault.
Géricault. This painting is called The Raft of the Medusa, and it's also around 1818, 1819, like the first painting that we looked at by
Right.
Constable. This is another sort of terrifying image, but in a different way.
This isn't nature, in a sense, overwhelming man. It's man's own brutality.
To man.
That's right.
Right. So the story here is that there's been a ship that's been wrecked off the coast of North Africa. The captain, steals away on the one life raft.
Exactly. What had happened is the captain, sort of assuming from a kind of greed, had put too much cargo on, and there were not enough lifeboats for all the passengers. And when this ship really fell into trouble, the captain ordered the carpenter of the ship to actually create a raft out of the lumber of the ship,
we see here.
to put over 100 passengers on, while he and his crew got into the life vessel.
Right.
Nice. And initially there was a rope, and they were to drag the raft, but
Right.
the captain realized quickly that he could not make
They
any
were not
headway.
going to survive. Right.
He cuts the rope and really basically abandons
Yeah.
the
I think
raft.
it was about 150 people on the raft.
Very few survived.
Right, I think about 13 or 15 people survived. There was cannibalism, there was murder.
Dying of exposure.
I mean,
Just
it was
a terrible human drama.
Hell on earth, right? This sort of unnecessary hell on earth.
But that's not entirely what Géricault is showing us, right? Géricault, it's so interesting because Géricault really researched this painting. This is a huge painting, and he went to the trial, he went to the morgue and looked
He
at drowned
interviewed
bodies.
survivors.
That's right.
He had the raft built in his studio.
That's right, he did. But when we
This
look
doesn't
at this,
really look.
no,
It didn't
this
look
is
like
this is a heroic construction,
Yeah.
and what we see is this incredible crescendo, this sort of pyramid composition of human bodies that have almost become a kind of seething mass that's
Right.
almost a singular mass, and of course they're rising up in incredible
Receding
but
diagonal line.
vain hope,
Right,
a
because
vain
they
hope.
see a ship on the horizon, but as the story unfolded, in the papers when it was finally told, there was a moment when they saw a ship on the horizon, and that
It never
saw
saw them.
them, and they would not be saved for several days later. What's interesting to me about this painting is also that what we have in paintings before this period, for example, with David, is we have death for a reason. We have heroic and noble
But here it's
self-sacrifice
senseless.
that wins something, that makes a point, that people die for a principle, they die for a reason, they die for their country, they sacrifice and their lives have meaning.
But here?
Not at all.
Here, it's an exemplar of corruption, and it actually is part of the political content of this painting.
Right, because the captain of the ship who abandoned these men on the raft had actually been appointed by the king. So this is a sort of indictment of the monarchy that had been restored in France after the failure, in a way, of the French Revolution.
There's a lot of levels of meaning to this painting.
There are.
And there are some incredibly beautiful vignettes, not only the hope of the crescendo of this wave of people rising
Right.
up, but in the opposite corner, in the lower left corner,
Here.
we have this sort of terrible moment, this quiet moment of a father mourning the
horrible.
body of his dead son.
Horrible.
And actually next to him,
Here.
the collapsed figure, whose back is exposed and arm reaches down to the water, was actually modeled by Delacroix.
Right, the great romantic
That's right,
painter.
but a younger painter who was actually studying in Géricault's studio.
Right.
Which is, I think, a wonderful little detail.
So we have, romanticism can mean in a way, a lot of different things, but there are things that unify it. I think that one of the ways to think about it is to think about the culture of this period grappling with a world that's radically different than the world that existed just 20 or 30 years
It's
before.
still largely unknown, and where there's a sense of control and order that has been lost.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting because what the artists have done to, in a sense, achieve that in a kind of formal sense is to reach back not to the neoclassical period, but really to reach back to the Baroque period
Right.
before that.
To the realism and emotionalism of the Baroque.
That's right, and of course it's destabilized compositions, the diagonals,
diagonal lines, the sort of grouping of figures together in a single motion.
the heavy emphasis on
Light and dark.
That's right, on light and dark, and just a kind of almost operatic gesture.
Absolutely. And interest in sort of getting to the viewer emotionally.
It's such an interesting moment.
It is.